We're going to look at Aristotle's Poetics today, one of the classic works of literary theory, in many ways more important and influential than Plato's Republic and Plato's theory of poetics, which we only really sketched out by looking at the Republic. We could have looked at a few other works by Plato as well. Plato seems more interested in inspiration than he is in the craft of poetry. As I said last time, he in the Republic, he seems more interested in who is more suited to depict reality. Is it the poets or is it the philosophers? And as we saw, he concluded it was the philosophers who were, because they looked at the essence of things in themselves, because they were looking at non-visual realities, specifically the realms of ideas, things in the intellect and things that we can perceive through the act of reasoning, like mathematics. Those are closer to reality according to Aristotle or to Plato. He seems to be following Pythagoras in many ways. Aristotle is more influential because he raises and opens the question of poetics itself and dedicates a whole volume to it, for that matter. And rather than just banishing the poets because of their lesser ability to grasp the real, Aristotle decides that they are actually a philosophical enterprise, which is interesting in and of itself. And I'll get into the reasoning that he gives for that, but also wants to depict the most excellent form of poetics, for that matter, which he decides is tragedy, which, for anyone who's just read Plato and who knows anything about the Greek world in which they both inhabit, would be very surprised, because again, as I said there, both Plato and the whole culture of the Greeks focuses on the epic. Homer is regarded as the teacher of all Greece. When Socrates is disputing with the learned teachers of his day, he is often engaging with those that we call the sophists, but also those who recite Homer's poetry. So wise sorts of teachers. So you would think, with that in mind, that the epic was the greatest literary form, but that's not what Aristotle concludes. Aristotle concludes that it is the tragedy. And his reasoning for that we're going to look at here today. Let me, if I did that, that didn't work. Why didn't that work? There it is. One of the things about Aristotle that some people like, other people don't like, is that Aristotle is very methodical in his writing. It's quite easy to read, but it's dense. He does not waste space. He gets right to the point, and he also is very gifted, supremely gifted at being able to break things down and to present a chain of thinking there. He organizes his thoughts extremely well. Plato is more of a poet, ironically, in his representation of things, to the point of using myths even to illustrate his points. And he does that quite regularly, actually. Whereas Aristotle is more clinical, even scientific in his depiction of things. He will break things down to their essences. And then, as I say, we can see here in the chapter divisions here, 26 of them we have, talk about what he is going to say and then go on to say it. So the first thing that's interesting here is that he regards imitation as the common principle of all the poetic arts, not just tragedy, but all of them have in common this one thing, which is called imitation. This word imitation is going to be very important for understanding poetics. The Greek word that Aristotle uses is mimesis, And it is the standard position of what art does, poetry does. It represents a reality. Now, this is exactly the reason why Plato was critical of the poets, because they were not very good at representing reality, not nearly as good as the philosophers. Their representation was at a third remove from reality because they didn't look at reality to begin with. If they did, they wouldn't be appealing to the passions, and they wouldn't be appealing to the lower parts of human nature, and they wouldn't portray the highest representatives of human nature, or those that are like them, namely the gods, as being immoral. That's one of the reasons. I mean, his main critique of the poet seems to be a theological one. It's not only Plato that holds this view, by the way. There were many philosophers who were critical of Homer and the poets for depicting the gods as they did. So while not being monotheistic, like it wasn't a theological criticism in that sense, it was more the specifics of the natures of the gods, which they said this cannot be right. And that seems to be what really upset Plato. You're depicting the gods as unjust. And we're learning by imitation from this that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with this. If the gods do it, after all, it's not wrong in principle. It's just we don't have the power to get away with it like they do. But if we did, we would, and we would just act the same way. And Plato sees the ethical consequences of this. This is terrible. You cannot depict people acting, or the greatest of individuals acting unjustly, and expect people to be better than those that they're imitating. And in a sense, mimesis is also intrinsic to Plato's position. And in fact, it is. That's hence the criticism. They are imitating, but they're imitating the wrong reality. They're depicting what they can see with their eyes. Yes, we can see that there are immoral people in the world. Yes, we can see that the unjust often get their way in life. The rich and the powerful, they get their way. But that doesn't mean that that is what reality is. That's just what we see. There is a thing called justice, which makes us sense the immorality of their actions. And that is higher than this. Let's depict those things: the good, the true, the beautiful, the just. That's what ought to be represented, because that is the standard that we appeal to when determining that those people have acted unjustly. There is a standard of justice. That's Plato's point. His point's well made, I think. Everyone recognizes the weight of his objection. Aristotle's not so concerned with a moral critique of the Homeric educational structure. He's not concerned with that. He's more interested, as he always is, with the essence of the thing he's describing. He does it in a quasi-scientific fashion. He's describing what he sees. At the same time, Aristotle is not merely somebody who takes snapshots of things and describes everything that he sees and doesn't. He is able to categorize it and get to the essence of things. This is where he becomes invaluable. What is the essence of this? Well, the essence of poetics is imitation, mimesis. It is of the essence of it. And so he will say, I propose to treat of poetry in itself and of its various kinds, noting the essential quality of each, right? He wants to get to the essence of it. To inquire into the structure of the plot, as requisite to a good poem, into the number and nature of the parts of which a poem is composed, and similarly into whatever falls within the same inquiry. Following then the order of nature, let us begin with the principles which come first. And so now he lists a variety of types of poetry, so epic poetry and tragedy, comedy also in dithyrambic, poetry in the music of the flute and the lyre in most of their forms, are all, in their general conception, modes of imitation. So there you go. They have this in common. In their general conception, they are modes of imitation. And note this word mode. It's the means through which the imitation happens. That's what he's interested in. It's the process. He's very interested in the process here. Now, one of the things that I'm going to try and do in terms of a study of poetics is to see Aristotle not just in his study of poetics, but more broadly in a work that Aristotle writes called the Posterior Analytics. Let me write this down here. We're not going to look at posterior analytics. However, the concept, or he does something there that I think is very important, which is to analyze objects according to 4 causes. He talks about 4 different causes of things. And the word cause, that as Aristotle uses them, is a little unusual because it's not going to fit under what we normally call a cause. We think of cause and effect, right? Ever since the scientific method and so forth, we think of things that initiate something else. And that is one of Aristotle's causes. One of his causes is called the efficient cause. One thing that it gets it going, it sets it in motion. But then we get to causes that we are not going to recognize as causes, like the formal cause. Like the particular form of the tragedy. It has a certain features that give it a form. He's also going to talk about the material cause. Material or the composition of the object concerned. Oops. And then finally, he's going to talk about the final cause or the purpose. To try and break this down a little bit, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but when we're studying a poem, we can just do what Aristotle here does essentially, which is to look at the process. And the process then is relating to the form and the material. But we can also look at it in terms of the one who's causing the process, who's the poet. And we can also look at the purpose of that in terms of the audience. What is the purpose of, why do we create poetry, or why do we write tragedies? What motivates the writer, and what is the effect on the audience? We can consider those things as part of consideration of whether something is a good play or a good poem. We consider not only how well the language is used, but how it moves the audience to a certain outcome. Does it disgust us? Does it inspire us? Those are considerations in the worth of a play. Does it make us want to be better individuals? Does it degrade us even though we enjoy it? We can watch something and we're totally captivated by it, but at the end of the production, we feel like we wish he hadn't seen it because in some ways we've been degraded in the process. Those are considerations when we want to consider poetics. Not just the mastery of the medium, because somebody can be a terrific wordsmith or terrific with images, if you want to put it in terms of film, since that's the dominant literary or dominant form of our day of poetics. You can be terrific at captivating the attention of the audience. Like they're mesmerized by what they see. And you can talk about the various ways in which they do that, and that can be very well done. You can come out of it and say, well, that was masterfully produced, but it lacked any substance whatsoever. There was no discernible plot. There was no story here that had a purpose in it, and the characters in it were superficial as can be. They were Barbies. We can go to, yes, I'm talking about the Barbie movie, which I haven't seen, I won't see. I'm not going to do it. I'm getting pushed to watch the Barbie movie, and I am firmly resisting. I will not see. I mean, it's advertising what it is, and I think, okay, well then I don't need to watch it to know there's enough. I want to see character because I think human nature is caught up in the whole enterprise, and I think human nature and human character is far more than the surface appearance. And Barbie's all surface, right? A certain appearance, that's the appearance. But what lies beneath the appearance? Is there something there that's being brought out in the production there? Like the character of the individual. Let's take a film popular in recent years, Lord of the Rings. We have characters there who have sometimes very complex motivations, but they involve certain moral qualities which we admire and make us want to watch the films. It's not just the tale of what's going to happen and when, and the intrigue and the interaction between good and evil forces. The evil lies within the characters as well as outside the characters, and that makes it complex. And we see that there is a resistance to evil, which is part of the battle that's being depicted. It's not just the battle between the orcs and the elves. It's within the individual, and they're struggling to resist giving themselves over to the same forces that have produced the orcs. So that character study is what partly makes it fascinating. There's an internal and external interplay there. So all of these things, as I say, you could just look at the formal cause and the material cause, but what is interesting about Aristotle is, though he is going to spend most of his time talking a bit about the process is intrinsically related to the efficient cause and the final cause for him. He doesn't spend so much time on those, but they're in the background. And I'm using his work, Posterior Analytics, to, in a sense, read his Poetics here. And the purpose of that isn't just to represent Aristotle, but to try and flesh out right here my view. I'm going to build on this as we go on, of what ought to characterize a sound view of poetics that will consider moral actions, that will consider the problems of human character, or even the virtues of human character. What makes us like certain characters and dislike other characters? It's not just because they're good guys and bad guys. In one of the critiques, I would say, of the Marvel films is often the evil characters. It's hard to describe them as evil, other than they're going to annihilate everything. Okay, well, that makes you like Thanos. He's going to kill half of the world or the universe's population. I guess that makes him bad. In that sense, he has a bad outcome. But is he a really evil individual? He doesn't seem to be. He's necessity. He serves necessity. It's not personal. He's doing what is going to happen anyway. He's just making it happen. He sees himself as good. Do we, in watching those films, get any philosophical critique of that perspective? Or we just see he's the opponent of the good characters, but the good characters, are they genuinely good in their motivations? Well, we see actually in the midst of the superheroes that many of them are rather degraded as moral beings, like Iron Man. He's a corrupt character in certain ways. He's a rich guy, and is that actually studied? Well, where there is complexity, it starts to become a little bit more interesting. But in general, the comic book superheroes are not interested in character. And the plot is pretty much like a game. There's going to be a fight and somebody's going to win. That's not a very complicated plot. It's not even a very interesting plot. And sometimes the bad guys lose, and that adds a little bit of interest to it. But in general, not a great deal. Is there moral teaching that comes out of it? I would say there is, and the moral teaching is that moral considerations are irrelevant in the battle between good and evil, in which case good and evil don't really mean anything because those are both moral categories, good and evil. Right? So if Thanos represents evil and yet evil doesn't mean anything, how much are we moved as an audience to want to be better people and to resist evil? Is it just entertaining us, or is it instructing us? I think it is instructing us, but the instruction is that good and evil are not considerations worthy of us as human beings. So there's a certain view of human nature that's implicit in the whole production. It's a very reductionistic, in some ways it's the exact same worldview that the Barbie movies present to us. I'm just trying to bring contemporary illustrations there, but there's a shallowness there. And it's not necessarily intrinsic to the medium. Film does not have to be as shallow and superficial as that. Watch movies from earlier eras. There is far more in a cowboy western in the studies of good and evil than we see in contemporary depictions. And the characters are sophisticated, often more complex than modern ones. We're largely caught up in CGI, the graphics, the spectacle. Does that make sense? And so a robust poetics or a robust critique of art is going to consider all of these things. Now, all of these things in terms of the efficient cause, the final cause, the purpose, is going to be an inherently moral enterprise. Actually, that was the nature of Plato's criticism of the poets. They were presenting the gods as immoral, and that is wrong. Note, it's a moral objection, but it's rooted in a view of truth. So note, he connects he has a moral objection, but he explains it in terms of a lack of awareness of the nature of ultimate reality. And the nature of ultimate reality is invisible, says Plato. And there's a correspondence between the visible world and the invisible world, and the invisible world is made up of forms that we can't see. And yet we acknowledge whenever we appeal to them in terms like goodness, beauty, truth, justice, etc. We can't see those. You've never seen justice. You've seen justice depicted. She's got a blindfold on. She's got scales there, and so that she's not blinded by what she sees herself. She's going to judge according to the principle and not just how beautiful the lawyer is in front of her, and how much money she's given. So she's not going to be swayed by those things, but rather the principles are at stake here. That's what justice is. That's how justice is being depicted there. Note that justice is very much a Platonic portrait there when justice is portrayed as blind. Not going to go on the basis of what she sees in front of her, but rather what is justice. That's going to be the motivation. Very Platonic. But it is an imitation of reality, but the reality is not what you see, but rather what lies behind it. And that what lies behind it isn't only, as Plato suggests in some ways, a matter of visible versus invisible, but rather the nature of the good itself. The nature of the good is connected with the true and the beautiful and the just. It is invisible, and it is related to human nature, yes, insofar as human nature is related to divine nature. And God alone is good and true and beautiful and just. God alone. And we are made in his image. This is how, as I say, as a Christian, I'm interpreting this, but I think there's a sense there that it's clear in even Plato and Aristotle. As Christians, we're going to say that the reason a play motivates us to love the good is because we, as image bearers of God, recognize something divine in us, which we nonetheless contradict in our actions because of sin. So this word, poetry, the word in the title, poetikos, literally refers, Aristotle's Poetics refers to things that are created or crafted or made. Note that Aristotle here does not talk about a copy. Plato has talked about copies at a third remove from reality, like the copy of, like a shadow on the wall. Aristotle is going to dispense with that phrase of copying. He's talking about creative acts of translation from one reality to another. It's a translation of sorts. But there's no loss inherent in it. Plato emphasizes the loss because he's criticizing the Homeric poets. How does he demonstrate the loss? Well, because he portrays the gods as immoral. Of course, something has gone wrong here. And wherein does the loss transpire? Well, between the invisible and the visible, and it's because they looked at the visible all along. And if they just looked at the invisible like the philosophers did, then we wouldn't have had this loss. That's his explanation. Plato is not interested in that, or Aristotle rather, is not interested in that explanation. He is going to say that there is something inherently philosophical about poetry, especially in works like tragedy, because the general principle is what is involved in the greatest works of tragedy. They are interested in the essences of things. Now, I said here at the outset, Plato talks about the epic poetry and the tragedy, the comedy, and the dithyrambic, music of the flute and the lyre, and all of them being in general conceptions, modes of imitation, yes, but he's going to focus his time on tragedy. He says he's going to deal with epic and comedy, but we don't have those works. If he wrote them, they've been lost. Still, what he says here is interesting because he says that basically there's no essential difference. And he also says that the tragedy is the most important of them. So if we take that as given, then if we're going to lose two of the three, I guess we would rather lose comedy and epic than tragedy. If Aristotle himself in his Poetics says this one's the most important, we've got this one. Okay, so good. Being each case, but they are forms of imitation, and they are imitations. They differ from one another in three respects. In the medium, that's these two. In the medium, in the objects, probably, and in the manner. That's not really dealing with the four causes here. For as there are persons who, by conscious art or mere habit, imitate and represent various objects through the medium of color and form, or again by the voice, or in the arts above mentioned, taken as a whole, the imitation is produced by rhythm, language, or harmony, either singly or combined. And now he's comparing music with poetry even. This is why he's talking so much about rhythm and language and harmony. And note that this is also very interesting. I'll build on this more when we get to the Christian era. He seems to think that music is like literature, drama, insofar as an imitation is taking place. So music is also imitating something, and it has an order and a harmony to it. That's going to be hugely influential when we come to Boethius's treatise on music, which he's going to connect. Music will be connected to astronomy and geometry and so forth. So all of reality is being seen in the one. But I'll skip over that, and I'll skip over this, and let me come to the second point here, which is the objects of imitation, the manner. Let's come to the definition of the tragedy. Section 6, he says, the poetry which imitates in hexameter verse, what is that? Epic, dactylic hexameter. So the type of poetry that presents things in 6 metrical feet, I'm going to deal with that elsewhere. I'm going to put the epic to one side, likewise the comedy. I'll deal with those later. Let us now discuss tragedy. But note that he distinguishes them actually in terms of the metrical form in which it's presented. That's also interesting. We don't really place much value on meter anymore. And that's partly because of the influence of the Romantics, who dispensed with, certainly with rhyme, but even meter to some degree in their poetry. They tend to follow Shakespeare's example and Milton's and write in unrhymed blank verse, so iambic pentameter. And then eventually it got dispensed with almost wholly. Come the 20th century, people even stopped worrying about meter, unless they're singing songs in which they bring it back, and they keep the rhyme for that matter. But there's a rhythm to it. But for him, the meter is an intrinsic part. This will be part of the material cause of the epic poem, not to be disregarded. One of the reasons we don't care so much about it is because modern translations, let's say of Homer, can't repeat the meter. It doesn't work in translation. It's not that you can't write in dactylic hexameter in English, it's you can't translate Homer's poem into dactylic hexameter without massacring the substance of the poem. When you rather retain the substance than worry about things that seem a little peripheral, like the meter. Okay, well, I'll get rid of that. I'll put it in a meter that works in English. Let's stick with that, and that's what the best translators tend to do. We're not going to worry about dactylic hexameter. Let me do it in iambic pentameter. It works better in English. And everyone says, okay, that's fine. You can't do it exactly, so we'll not worry about that. But Aristotle does think of it's important when he comes to this. But he's going to set those aside and focus on tragedy. What is tragedy then? Okay, once again, it's an imitation, it's a mimesis, but it's an imitation of an action. This will, in some ways, relate to human nature. Human beings act. They don't just a human being is different than an animal for Aristotle, because we do things out of freedom. We choose to do this and not that. Animals don't choose things, as far as we know, other than by any other process than natural instinct. And the proof of this is we see no works of art from any other animal. Even something as sophisticated as a bird who manages to thatch its nest very intricately, or spiders that do their webs, they do the exact same thing over and over. There's no progress on it. There's no change. There's no purpose to it other than that of a very functional design, and it works magnificently well. I've seen scientific depictions of how spiders weave their webs and how they work, and how there's a mathematical precision to it that makes them highly effective. But magnificent creation, but all the same. Spider webs look the same today as they did thousands of years ago. Plays do not. So it's an imitation of it, because what the action is of actors, and the actors represent human beings. By the way, the tragic actors wore masks. He doesn't talk about that. He doesn't think it's worth mentioning, because it's probably not worth mentioning. But for us it is, because our actors don't wear masks. So when he's talking about this, he's thinking primarily of the words and not the facial expressions. In fact, he's not going to care about the facial expressions, because you can't see their faces. They wear a mask which is covers the whole face, and then it has a hole in the mouth, but the effect of the hole is to amplify your voice, just like I'm doing now, and you can hear it. So it projects to the back of the amphitheater. He doesn't state that. I'm telling you that. So he's more concerned then about in other words, even though it's dramatic and it's on stage and it's visual in one sense, the real focus of any drama for Aristotle is in the words spoken by the actors. We don't see their faces. We see their interactions. Those aren't so important. What they are saying to one another is more important. So in a sense, it's closer to what we would call poetry than what we see as drama, because drama now for us involves beautiful Hollywood actors and close-ups on their faces. twitching when they're upset or whatever, or whatever, but very much focus on the visual face there. Not even a consideration for him. It's the words, and the words are related to the character of the individuals depicted in front of us. Must be said, an important consideration. Well, it's an imitation in action. What sort of action? Serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, greatness, a certain greatness. But it's serious, it's complete, and it's of a certain magnitude. In language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament. So it's very, not your common speech. It's a sort of heightened language, using a lot of rhetorical devices, a lot of puns, word plays. When you come to Oedipus the King, which is his primary focus, there's a lot of double entendre there. Complexity. The several kinds being found in separate parts of the play. In the form of action, not of narrative. So it's not like an epic. It's dealing with action. So you have speakers caught up in an action, and they are motivated to talk about the action. There's no narrator that intervenes and tells us the backstory of how Oedipus got where he is, or what he's thinking. We have no idea what he's thinking, by the way. We know what he says. We don't know what he's thinking unless he tells us that, and he usually doesn't. And he certainly doesn't tell us anything that the audience and the other actors don't know. So he doesn't do a soliloquy. He doesn't come to the front of the stage and say to be or not to be. That's the question, whether it's nobler in the human mind, right? That's Hamlet. He is telling us Shakespeare is telling us what Hamlet is thinking there by giving him a soliloquy. Not so in Aristotle or in any of the Athenian dramatists. They're not interested in showing us the psychology of the character. We see the psychology of the character in how he speaks to the others. We have to infer it. It's in the background there, or inside the mask. It's in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear, affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. I'm going to have to say more about that later. But through pity and fear. Now go back a bit. He wants to amplify what he said earlier by language embellished. That's what he meant here. I mean language in which rhythm, harmony, and song enter. So if you ever watch a tragedy by Aeschylus or Sophocles or Euripides, it involves a chorus, and there's a strophe and antistrophe, and they're sort of moving around on the stage. And they're actually wearing heels that make a noise as they walk on the stage. They're wooden heels, and so they make a clopping around, and the chorus likewise dancing around. So there's a sort of a dance element, as well as the chorus is actually speaking but singing. So there are musical qualities there in the tragedy, which, again, modern dramas tend not to have. And so there's something cultic about it, perhaps. Some think that the tragedies, and I think Aristotle touches on this a little bit, might have arisen out of the cult of Dionysus. In fact, the tragic festivals are dedicated to the god Dionysus, who is otherwise known as Bacchus. And associated with sexual rites and so forth as well. He's also torn apart by his followers. Dionysus has a group of women following him called Maenads, who get themselves into a rock star type cult frenzy, following and screaming about the god Dionysus, who's like, but also torn apart and dies and comes back to life. Never mind. I don't need to get into the specifics of the Dionysus cult, just to say that the tragic festivals were performed at a festival dedicated to the god Dionysus. And so this is the reason that some people think that the tragic actors wore wooden heels is to sound like a goat. It's a goat dance. Tragos being a goat. Some suggest the etymology is there. So there's something religious about this. And the religion which is associated oddly with goats and so forth, is somehow, according to Aristotle, more important than the specifics that Dionysus called. He's not interested in that. He could criticize that. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to focus on what seems to be worthy in the tragic festival, which is the focus on everything he's described here. An action, serious, complete, of a certain greatness, with very exalted language, which affects a sort of purgation of pity and fear in the audience. Final cause, the purpose is to have an effect on the audience. He doesn't get much into the reason why a tragic dramatist decides to write these things. It's not just to win the prize. Although when he does discuss it, which he does briefly, it's the same purpose as the philosopher does. He's trying to get to the truth about human nature. And we see it in the tragedy. What's the tragedy of human nature? The tragedy of human nature is that we're mortal. And we don't see very clearly. The same thing that Plato complains about. So his character, his main character, Oedipus, and Oedipus the king, is trying to avoid murdering his father and marrying his mother. And he thinks he's done it. He flees his mother and father, so that he won't kill his father by accident or marry his mother. I don't know how he would do that, since he knows he shouldn't do that, and this is my father and mother, this is not a danger. But I guess if you want to be extra special, super cautious, you leave them behind so that doesn't happen. And by doing so, he fulfills the fate which was given to his parents before he was ever born, which is they were given the same prophecy that their son would do this to them. So what they did is try, rather than keep the boy with them, they give the boy away. And so he doesn't know who he is. And they don't know who he is. They give the boy away to a shepherd. The shepherd takes the child to another city where he's raised by parents who don't tell him that they're his adopted parents and not his real parents. He grows up thinking he's a Corinthian. But he has no idea that he's actually been adopted. And then somebody tells him at a drunken party, those aren't your parents. And whenever there's that sort of allegation, a hint of scandal here, well, what's going on? I'm illegitimate. I thought these were my real parents. They've adopted me. No, okay. So he leaves his adopted parents, assuming that they're his actual parents, and on the road meets his father, who insults him, and he kills him. He has no idea it's his father. And then he goes back further down the road and finds that the place that his father had departed from has lost a king. News travels quickly. They've lost a king, and they are without governance. And they're like Oedipus. When he's away from his village, their injustice is breaking out. And furthermore, the gods are cursing his town because a son has murdered a father. The town of Thebes, the city of Thebes, is being cursed. He solves the riddle of the phoenix, the Sphinx, who gives the riddle of man. What's the riddle of man?
The person who is the one who crawls and then
walks on 4 legs
yeah.
in the morning,
and then he walks on
2 days at noon,
and then he walks on 3 legs,
and then three legs in the evening. What is that? What is it that walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? And the answer is man. It's also specifically Oedipus, of course. because by the end of the play, he's going to blind himself and he's going to have a cane. So it's specifically going to relate to Oedipus himself. However, the reason why Aristotle says this is such a profound tragedy is it's not only talking about Oedipus, it's talking about human nature. Human nature is that we don't know ourselves. And that's the very thing that the Delphic oracle says to Socrates, but also to Plato, also to Oedipus. When he goes to this, he won't answer. Delphic oracle will not tell him who he is. What does the Delphic oracle exactly say to Oedipus? I've forgotten right now. I think it's just silent. Won't say anything. But for Aristotle and his audience, by this point, Socrates is famous. They know what the Delphic oracle said to Socrates, which is to know himself. I mentioned this last time, the famous Greek gnomic phrase, gnothi se auton, know thyself, know yourself. The riddle of human nature. Oedipus is a riddle to himself. I'll further amplify that. It's played on. There's a play in words there, talking about the formal and the material cause the composition. How is the riddle of Oedipus's nature and also of human nature expressed in the play? It's in his name. It's not just that he goes around as a baby. At the beginning of the play, he's depicted as an infant whose ankles are pierced with a brooch, and then walks around in the light of day thinking that he can see everything clearly when he's blinded as to who he is. And then by the end of the play, he's going to have a cane to help him tap his way forward because he's blind, so 3 legs. It's also his very name which will depict this. What's his name? Oedipus. Now, there's a little pun here. I'll translate it into English. Oida pu. Oida here is from the Greek verb to know. I'll just say know. What do I know? What do I know? He's a riddle to himself. He thinks that, and he's the wise man who solved the riddle of the Sphinx. Everyone regards him as the wisest man. He solved when Thebes was being destroyed by the Sphinx, it was Oedipus that solved the riddle and said, it's a man. You saw it. So he's considered to be a great leader. The Sphinx was destroyed in the process. He saved Thebes. Yes, but when he stayed behind, the man who solved the riddle about from the Sphinx didn't understand how it applied to himself. And one of the ironies of the play, and this is one of the verbal features of the material composition, is that there's intrinsic dramatic irony because everybody eventually knows, everyone knows that Oedipus is the curse on his own city, but Oedipus himself doesn't realize it. Literally everybody knows before Oedipus. He's the last person to know. He claims to be wise, and he claims that the prophet, the blind prophet, who does know the truth, doesn't know the truth. So there's a contrast between the religious figure, Tiresias, who's blind, and Oedipus, the man who has physical sight, but actually no awareness of who he is. So there's terrific tensions and ironies. When I say irony, dramatic irony, the whole audience is aware that Oedipus is the cause of the curse on his city. And he, on the other hand, thinks that he is going to solve the curse. And it must be somebody else, because it can't possibly be him, because he knows who his parents are. He left them behind. And then he hears the story of how he ended up getting there, and eventually the breadcrumbs come back and they all lead to Oedipus, and he, in horror, blinds himself at the moral outrage that he's brought upon his family and his city and upon his very parents, murdering his father and sleeping with his mother, committing parricide and incest, both taboos, the worst thing he could ever do, he did. And he didn't even know he did it. Aristotle thinks that there's something in this story which applies to human nature. Isn't that interesting? He thinks it's the best of the tragedies. Note that it relates to human nature. Now, this is why I think Aristotle is rather profound. Because Aristotle he's not just commenting about the Greek theater, he's saying that it refers to human nature. That we are, in a sense, blind to our own nature and motivations and actions. We are blind to it. And yet we think we know what we're doing. Well, in a very real sense, he sounds a lot like Plato in his criticism of the Homeric poets. The Homeric poets also didn't understand and misrepresented things. They're a lot like Oedipus. The Homeric poets, who thought they could see, were in fact blind. So it's a very similar sort of critique, actually. You see what I mean? But Aristotle extends his critique of the Homeric poets to the entirety of humanity. Here's the problem with human nature. It's not just a problem with the teachers, namely the Homeric poets, it's the problem with humanity in general. We seem to think that we know things and actually act like fools. We think we're wise. That's my take on it at any rate. Now, back here, tragedy is the imitation of an action, and an action implies personal agents. Now, this phrase, personal agents, the translation here, but people who are actors who can take actions out of choice, and by choice, moral accountability is assumed of them. As I say, animals are not capable of moral choice, which is why there's no such thing as a bad cat or a bad dog. Like really, if a dog bites you, you say bad dog, but you don't really mean that there's something morally corrupt about the dog. You might have to put the dog down if he bites your hand, because he's got used to doing something that dogs know they ought not to do, so you might have to deal with it that way. But you don't actually believe that there's a corruption in a particular type of animal, a moral corruption. That's an anthropomorphism. We're attributing human characteristics to animals. When we say that an animal gets rabies and goes mad, it's because it's staggering and frothing at the mouth, and if it bites you, it's going to give it to you as well. But it acts erratically and not like its normal pattern of behavior. But it's not actually mad in the sense it's lost its sanity. It's just, well, you know what mad animals do. They've lost control of themselves, but it's not a moral failure. But we attribute it a mental failure and connect it to a certain moral type of action. Again, it's an anthropomorphism to say that it's a mad animal. So you have to put it down. It's not so. But it is true of human beings. Human beings can contradict their moral nature, but they have one to begin with. Animals don't have a moral nature. They don't have the capacity for choice, and we don't expect that they will. You can train a dog to obey. And until it obeys, you may say that it's not a very well-behaved dog. What we really mean is that that the owner has not trained the dog to act in a certain fashion, which it could be taught. So actually, the bad dog is actually a bad owner. Hasn't been trained in that way. But it implies personal agents. The mask that they wear are called a persona, by the way, who necessarily possess certain distinctive qualities of both character and thought. Note that as well. For it is by these that we qualify actions themselves. So it's not just the actions, like an action movie. It's the thought and character that underlie the actions, that's the central criteria of whether we have a plot. Thought and character are the two natural causes from which actions spring. And on actions, again, all success or failure depends. Hence, the plot is the imitation of the action. The plot is the imitation of the action. For by plot, I here mean the arrangement of the incidents. By character, I mean that in virtue of which we ascribe certain qualities to the agents. Certain qualities to the agents, that's what I mean by character. Note that Aristotle always defines his terms. His definitions are also terrific. He's very, very precise. I mean this, and sometimes you say, I don't mean that. But he's very, very clear about what he means by these terms. This is why he's so valuable. By the way, the terms that we get from Aristotle in Greek have passed into the English language. Thought is required wherever a statement is proved, or it may be a general truth enunciated. So thought isn't just the capacity for thinking, it's whenever a statement is proved, so it becomes logical. That's when thought is demonstrated. Not just through speech, but through speech that comports or fits with truth. Then thought is demonstrated. Or it may be a general truth, and this is one of the reasons why he's going to say that tragedy is essentially very much like philosophy. It declares essential truths about human nature, just like the philosopher does. So whereas Plato pushes the poets away from the philosophers, Aristotle pulls them closer together. He might agree that the philosophers are better at it, but in a sense, he's not going to throw the poets under the bus, let alone throw them out of the Republic. The poets do what they do. And they do it from the same motivation, to get to the truth of the matter. At least the best ones, like Sophocles, do. Every tragedy must have 6 parts: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, song. 2 constitute the medium of imitation, 1 the manner, and 3 the objects of imitation. So 2 are the medium of imitation. Plot and character, these are the ones that interest him the most. He's going to spend the majority of his time, actually he's going to spend half of his time discussing plot in the Poetics. Character is also part of the medium of imitation. 1 is the manner. What's the manner of imitation? Diction, the language, not the thought. Isn't that interesting? We associate thoughts with words. Aristotle is going to say, no, let's focus on the words. The object of imitation is thought, spectacle, and song. So what we are thinking, Plato says that's the immediate object. Aristotle says that it is the object of imitation. He, in a sense, agrees with Plato. It is the thoughts that we are imitating, but we imitate the thoughts through the words. So there you go. The correspondence between words and truth is the medium is the words, but there is a relation there. Spectacle and song I'll just leave aside. Spectacle is what you see, song is what you hear. The thought is what you're actually being portrayed. So it's an intrinsically philosophical enterprise in that sense. And these complete the list. These elements may have been employed, we may say, by the poets to a man. In fact, every play contains spectacular elements as well as character. So every play contains some spectacular elements. But he's not going to be interested in this, because the most important of all, and this is what I like about Aristotle again, he goes after the most important thing. So he focuses on the main and most important thing in every object that he describes. He doesn't get caught up in superficial. So a good critique of a thing is not just getting sidetracked by the appearance of the actor. It's going to go to the essence of the play itself. I'm not going to criticize the Barbie movie for whatever the actress looks like. I don't know her name. If you read a review, they'll probably talk about how she's perfect for the role and because of who knows what qualities she has. What's the essence of the movie? Do they even take any interest in that? Not really. Not usually. But for Aristotle, the most important of all is the structure of the incidents. Why? For tragedy is an imitation not of men, but of an action and of life. And life consists in action, and its end is a mode of action, not a quality. What does he mean by this? Life consists in action. What does he mean by that? You have to distinguish between, there's a certain type, we will associate everything with action. Every time you move, that's an action. When a baby moves his hand, you'll say that's an action. Aristotle says no. I'm not interested in that sort of thing. Walking from point A to point B is not what he calls an action. Action is specifically what we see in the political realm. It's not that that on the surface they may appear similar, but what the political life is there is to convey immortality. Something of worth and intrinsic human worth we are going to repeat and tell to subsequent generations, just like Homer does in his Iliad and Odyssey. He's going to depict a certain character of greatness that we want to imitate. That's what an action is. That's what the polis is there to ensure, is that essentially human characteristics are being depicted and commended. The Greek playwrights did not have pornography on stage. There's an action, we would say. There's action, there's sexual action. They have no interest in that. Animals also have sexual actions. Why is that being portrayed on stage? We have no interest in what's common between animals and human beings. What is distinctive to human nature, that's what we want to focus on in the play, that we all want to gather around and watch this. So that when he talks about an action, he's talking about the things distinctive to human nature. Again, babies move themselves, wolves just like animals, no interest in that. Human beings do it just like animals, no interest in that. The action is connected to the moral quality and character of the individuals, which human beings are. That's what we want to see there. When he says that life consists in action, he means a distinctively human life consists in that. And with that, he is going to describe what I said last time, two types of life that Aristotle recognizes as worthy of human nature. One is the political life, the life of action, the bios politikos, he calls it. And the other is the philosopher's life, the theoretical life, the life of the mind. Those two are lives worthy of the designation human, and they are also types of action. One is a physical action, the other is a mental action. Anyway, now character determines men's qualities, but it is by their actions that they are happy or the reverse. Character determines it, but it's actually their actions that are going to produce a happy outcome or not. You can have a virtuous character, but if in the end you get shot with an arrow, your outcome is bad. Character is going to determine to some degree your destiny, but not always. The greatest character in Greek fiction is Achilles. He died young. But he chose to die young. He chose to die a great life and die young rather than live to ripe old age and see his grandchildren grow up, because he so desired great deeds to be remembered by. That's what determined him. That's his choice. Now, so his character being recommended to his audience, or is it being deplored by Homer? It's being commended. The great Achilles. Be like Achilles. As I say, Alexander sleeps with Achilles, the Iliad under his bed. He's the role model for the Greeks. Be like an Achilles. Dramatic action, therefore, is not with a view to the representation of character. Character comes in as subsidiary to the action. So the actions, for Aristotle, the greatest element of any tragedy is the plot. Plot is really important, the action depicted. The incidents in the plot are the end of a tragedy, and the end is the chief thing of all. Again, Without action, there cannot be a tragedy. There may be without character. There may be. The tragedies of most of the modern poets fail in the rendering of character, and of poets in general this is often true. Same in painting. I'll skip over this. Plot is the first principle, and as it were, the soul of a tragedy. Character holds the second place. So he's even telling us the importance here. Similar scene in painting. Note that he is willing to put different mediums alongside of one another and say the same thing. Both are representing something, representing a truth. Painting does as well. He doesn't think painting is as significant. He doesn't devote a treatise to painting. He does to poetics. He thinks that words are more importantly related to our thoughts. And thoughts, he agrees with Plato, are the essence of human nature because it relates to truth and beauty and justice and so forth. It's a thought. That's what's being represented. But we understand that most clearly through speech because words and thoughts are intimately connected. Third order is thought. It's the faculty of saying what is possible and pertinent. And fourth, diction. And he's just going over what he says. Okay, these principles being established, let's now discuss the proper structure of a plot. Okay. We've already got this. Let's dig down at section 7 here. Now, according to our definition, tragedy is an imitation of an action that is complete, whole of a certain magnitude, repeating himself. For there may be a whole that is wanting in magnitude. So it's whole, but it's not great. But tragedy will deal with greatness. A whole which is that which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay, there you go. It has an end. There are actually many plays that do not conclude now. The action's not complete. It's like a ... Oh, there's a continuation, part 2. That's an incomplete action. It's not finishing at all. He will say that that's not going to suffice here. A tragedy has to be complete. And it has to be related to the beginning as well. There's a certain whole to it and design to it. Beginning is that which does not itself follow anything by causal necessity, but after which something naturally is or comes to an end. An end, on the contrary, is that which itself naturally follows some other thing. So a middle is something which has that. A well-constructed plot, therefore, must neither begin nor end at haphazard, but conform to these principles. So there are principles to it. There's a logic and a structure to it. So the efficient cause, what motivates the whole action, is related to the final cause, the purpose, the outcome, and how they do it. So there's a real design to it. And the design needs to be conspicuous. We tend to think if the artist's conceptions are conspicuous to the audience, that it's a little bit artificial. That doesn't bother Aristotle at all. Of course it's artificial. That's because it's art. The most natural things are the things that are artificially contrived that comport with human nature. We can't appeal to human nature without art, and art should illustrate what human nature is. I'll skip over this because he's going to talk about general principles here. Unity of plot does not consist in the unity of the hero. I'll skip over that. It is evident from what has been said that it is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen, what is possible according to the law of probability or necessity. So he's not doing what a history account. It's not a history account. History account tells you what happened. A poetic account can tell you what may happen. And in the may, the possibility, something philosophical is being depicted there. So, in our day, why is this important? In our day, there's this great tendency to suggest that every life, every choice of life, needs to be revered. Every human identity, I identify as this or that, and everyone else should celebrate that. Why not? How come? On one level, this is a person. He, she, whatever, thinks it's important. Therefore, I am going to depict it because this person is a person. And if I don't do that, in some sense, I'm suggesting that what they regard as important is not as important as they think it is. So we're going to equally celebrate that. Aristotle comes at it from the other vantage point and says, well, actually, there is a one uniform human identity which everybody who, for all of their individual distinctness, comports with, and that's what we're going to look at. So there is a view of human nature, a common view of human nature. And we're going to put it under certain conditions of probability or necessity there. But why would the probability or necessity fit? Because there's not infinite possibility there. And the infinite possibilities are largely irrelevant. What is going to be probable or necessary is that in the case of human sexual nature, be male or female. These are necessities. There might be some that are slightly outside the boundaries, but actually that's not going to affect the audience much because we are not the exceptions to the rule. We are the rule. We're subject to the rule. That's what we're depicting. So on this front, the poet and the historian differ, not by writing in verse or in prose. That's not what makes the difference. Historians write in prose. They don't use meter. But that's not what essentially distinguishes them. The true difference is that one relates to what has happened, the other to what may happen. Poetry, therefore, here we go, is more philosophical and a higher thing than history. Sorry, historian colleagues. By the way, I think Aristotle is not quite right here about history, by the way, because from a Christian vantage point, you can see history as providence. And so you see what could have happened and what did happen. It's a different view of history. Aristotle doesn't see any person behind history that is driving the plot on. He thinks that history is fatalistic. He's a fatalist because the Greeks are fatalists, whereas we believe that God ordains history and has providence so we can see design in it, and therefore it can still be philosophical. So I would beg to disagree with him here on this point. But that's only from a Christian vantage point. From the general perspective of depicting historical events, well, he actually did this, and you're not going to change what the individual did. Whereas poetry is very happy to change the order of events and the significance of them to illustrate something important about human nature. And we have no objections to doing that at all. So it's universal. By the universal, I mean how a person of a certain type will on occasion speak or act according to the law of probability or necessity, and is this universality at which poetry aims in the names she attaches to the personages. The particular is what Alcibiades did or suffered. In comedy, this is already apparent, but tragedies still keep to real names, the reason being that what is possible is credible. What has not happened, we do not feel at once feel sure to be possible. What is manifestly possible. So, not only of a complete action, but events inspiring fear or pity. Let me conclude with this because we're running out of time here. So it's what's possible. Not what happened, but what could happen in these. Why could it happen? Because action allows the freedom of individuals to do things that are unusual. And we see this happen. People do unusual things. Because they have the freedom to choose things, they sometimes do rather unusual things. We're not interested in the fact that they're unusual. We're interested when the unusual things that they choose illustrate something profoundly true about human nature in general. That's when we take interest. Not just the oddness of the individual, but there's something that relates to all of us in this. And it brings out a sense of tragedy when it produces pity and fear in us. They follow as if affected by a cause and effect relationship. The tragic wonder will be greater than if they happened of themselves or by accident, or even coincidence is most striking. Why is the tragedy of Oedipus one that inspires pity and fear? Because we have a man, a good man, a man better than us, actually. He's an aristocrat, he's highborn, most of us aren't, who tries to do the right thing and the best thing and to pursue injustice. He wants to get rid of it. He wants to do the right thing, and yet he does the wrong thing. Is that not going to produce fear in the audience? I, trying to do the right thing, may still do the wrong thing, even though it seems right in my own eyes. He doesn't have an ulterior motive. even. Like sometimes on stage these days, we know the ulterior motive of somebody. They're acting just to get a certain outcome. They're pretending to be a good person when really they're a bad guy in disguise. That's not the case with Oedipus. Here's a good guy, at least to the audience's perspective, and even to himself. He has wholly worthy motives, and yet he does the most abominable thing. And if he can do it, he who is better than us, with the worthiest of motives, can do such a heinous thing as he did, it prompts a great deal of pity on our parts, that such a good man could have such an unworthy outcome. And fear, this is an ethical end then. It ought to lead us to realize that we are not gods. Remember, it's the festival of Bacchus and the divinities of the the Greek world. It leads us to a sort of a reverence and an awareness of our own fallibility there. And so there's a limitation on our sense of our own greatness. He thinks that's important. And he doesn't point to sin here. The word that he uses for the fault of Oedipus is a mistake. It's a hamartia. He uses this word. It's one of the 4 words in the New Testament used for sin. He doesn't mean sin by it. He misses the mark. He gets it wrong. But we will, with the Christian conception revealed in Scripture, say that actually there was more than Aristotle is aware of when he's describing these things. It is actually sin that misleads him. Again, not out of conscious awareness, but still ultimately this is the cause of his failing, not just a lack of awareness. I think I'm done for now. I'm taking a bit over time. Sorry for that if I